And I would like to welcome Reverend Bobby Kilgore for speaking with us today. The topic today is religion and mythology. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Beth. So, I was joking around with somebody one day and I said, so whose myth is true, your myth or my myth? And we all laughed. And I went home and I reflected on that. And I was like, myth and religion, are the differences? Are the similarities? What constitutes a myth? What constitutes religion? Are some religions myths? So I did a little research. Now, religion and mythology differ in scope, but they have overlapping aspects. Both terms refer to systems and concepts that are of high importance to certain communities, making statements concerning the supernatural or the sacred. Generally, mythology is considered one component or aspect of religion. Religion is the broader term. Besides mythological aspects, it includes aspects of ritual, morality, theology, and mystical experience. A given mythology is almost always associated with a certain religion, such as Greek mythology and ancient Greek religion. Disconnected from its religious systems, a myth may lose an immediate relevance to the community, and it may evolve away from sacred importance into a legend or even a folk tale. There is a complex relationship between the recital of myths and the enactment of rituals. The relationship between religion and myth depends on the definition of myth one uses. Now, by Robert Graves' definition, he says, our religious traditional stories are myths if and only if one does not belong to the religion in question. By Segal's definition, all religious stories are myths, but simply because nearly all stories are myths. Now, by the folklorist definition, all myths are religious or sacred stories, but not all religious stories are myths. Religious stories that involve the creation of the world, for example, the book of Genesis, are myths. However, some religious stories that don't explain how things came to be into their present form, hagiographies of famous saints, for example, are not myths. Generally, mythology is the main component of religion alongside ritual. And you keep seeing this word ritual pop up. This is very important. For example, in the early modern period, distinguished Christian theologians developed elaborated witch mythologies, which contributed, of course, to the intensification of the Salem witch trials. The Oxford Companion to World Mythology provides the following summary and examples. Religious stories or holy scriptures to believers, narratives used to support, explain, justify a particular system's rituals, theology, and ethics, and are myths to people of the other culture belief systems. It is difficult to believe that the Buddha was conceived in a dream by a white elephant. So we call that story a myth as well. But of course, stories are the parting of the reeds for the fleeing Hebrews, Muhammad's night journey, and the dead Jesus rising from the tomb are just clearly irrational narratives to which a Hindu or a Buddhist might understandably apply the word myth. All of these stories are definable as myths because they contain events that contradict both our intellectual and physical experience of reality. Most definitions of myth limit myths to stories. Thus, non-narrative elements of religion, such as ritual, are not myths. So let's talk a moment about theology and myth. The term theology, for the first time, appeared in the writings of the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Initially, theology and mythology were synonymous. With time, both terms gained distinctive qualities. In the first place, theology is a spiritual or religious attempt for the believers to explicate their faith. In this sense, It is not neutral and is not attempted from the perspective of the removed observer. In contrast, general history of religion provide a formal or indifferent scheme devoid of presuppositions within all religions must be subsumed. In the second place, theology is influenced by its origins, and its origins are in the Greek and Christian traditions, with the implication that the transmutation of this concept to other religions is endangered by the very circumstances of origination. In other words, where that myth or that story comes from. Now, according to Hurd, both primitive and modern theology is inescapably constrained by the mythological backbone. Hermeneutically, theologians must recognize that mythical thought permeates in the biblical texts. Dogmatically, theologians must be aware of the mythological elements of theology and how extensive theology relies on mythical forms and functions, especially in the light of our awareness and the ubiquity of myth. Now, when I read this, I watched this comedy in Ireland called Mrs. Brown's Boys. Mrs. Brown is a gentleman dressed up as a lady and plays part of Mrs. Brown. Two Mormons came by to visit. And Mrs. Brown is trying to explain to them that the Bible is made up. The two Mormon missionaries like, no, ma'am, it's not. And she's like, think about it. She says, Norman, what did Norman have in his ark? Well, we believe his name is Noah. Well, in Ireland, we call him frickin' Norman. What did he have in his ark? Two of every animal on a boat. She said, we had two gerbils and they about shite us out of the house in the mud. So let's talk about religion. Now, religion is a belief concerning the supernatural, the sacred, or divine, and the moral codes, practices, values, and institutions associated with such belief. Although some scholars, such as Durkheim, would argue that the supernatural and the divine are not aspects of all religions. Religious beliefs and practices may include the following: a deity, of course, or higher being, estatology, practices of worship, practices of ethics and politics, and some religions do not include all these features. Now, in mythology, the term mythology usually refers to a system of myths, the study of myths. However, the word myth itself has multiple and sometimes contradictory definitions. In 2007, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, quote, myth, a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serve to unfold part of the worldview of a people or to explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. Parable, allegory, a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially one embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or a segment of society. Unfounded or false notion, a person or thing having only imaginary or unverifiable existence, the whole body of myths. So in regards to the study of culture and religions, these are some definitions that scholars have used. In 1968, the classicist Robert Graves defines myth as whatever religious or heroic legends are so foreign to a student's experience that he cannot believe them to be true. In 1973, another classicist, G.S. Kirk, rejects the notion that all myths are religious or sacred. In the category of myth, he includes the legendary accounts that are secular for all practical purposes. In 1997, folklorists define a myth as a sacred narrative, explaining how the world and humankind came to be in their present form. In 2004, in religious studies, the word myth usually was reserved for stories whose main characters were gods or demigods. In 2004, In religious stories, myth usually was reserved for studies whose main characters, again, were gods or demigods. In 2004, the classicist Richard Burton defined myths as socially powerful or a traditional story, and others handed down. Robert Segal, professor of all theories of religion at the Lancaster University, defines myths broadly as any story whose main figure are personalities, divine, human, or even animal. Excluded would be impersonal forces such as Plato's good. Now, again, religion and myths have similarities. So let's talk about these. Given any of the above definitions of myth, the myths of many religions, both ancient and modern, share common elements. Widespread similarities between religious mythologies include the following: an initial paradise preceding ordinary historical time, the story of a god who undergoes death and resurrection, the death rebirth deity. The mythical geography of many religions involves axis mundi, or cosmic myths, supreme deity, hero's journey. The similarities between cultures and time periods can be useful, but it is usually not easy to combine beliefs and histories from different groups. Simplification of cultures and time periods by eliminating detailed data remain vulnerable or flimsy in this area of research. Contrasts between religious mythologies. Though there are similarities among most religious mythologies, there are also contrasts. Many mythologies focus on explanations of the universe, natural phenomena, or other themes of human existence, often ascribing agency to one or more deities or other supernatural forces. However, some religions have very few of this kind of cosmic explanation. For example, the Buddhist parable of the arrow warns against such speculations as, is the world eternal or not eternal? Is a soul different from the body? Does enlightenment exist after death or not? Viewing them as irrelevant to the goal of escaping suffering. Academic views. Now, in academia, the term myth often refers to stories whose culture regards them as true as opposed to fictional. Thus, many scholars will call a body of stories mythology, leaving open the question whether the stories are true or false. For example, in Trees of Souls, the mythology of Judaism, English professor Howard Schwartz writes, the definition of mythology offered here does not attempt false. In other words, are they historically accurate or not? Since the beginning of modern philosophy and science in the 16th century, many Western intellectuals have seen myths as outdated. In fact, some argued that the Christian religion would be better off without mythology, or even that Christianity would be better off without religion. J.A.T. Robinson argued in favor of detaching the Christian doctrine of God from any necessary dependence on a supernaturalistic worldview. Excuse me. He understood this as a prophetic aspect of the Christian's ministry, and especially the ministry to the world. At this time, atheism was regarded as the Christian gospel that should be preached to the world, according to J.J. Altizer. For example, he maintained this boldly by stating, throughout its history, Christian theology has been thwarted from reaching its intrinsic goal by its bondage to a transcendent sovereign, an impassive God. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer called persistently for religionless Christianity. Now, in the 20th century, many scholars have resisted this trend, defending myth from modern criticism. Mircea Eliade, a professor of history of religions, declared that myth did not hold religion back, that myth was an essential foundation of religion, and that by eliminating myth, we eliminate a piece of the human psyche. Eliot approached myths really sympathetically at a time when religious thinkers were trying to purge religions of mythology or mythological elements. Eliot wrote about sky and sky gods when Christian theology was shaken at its very foundations by the death of God theology. He spoke of God up there when theologians such as J.A.T. Robinson were busy with erasing mythical language from a three-storied universe that underlies the early Christian thought and experience. Similarly, Joseph Campbell believed that people should not and could not understand their individual lives without mythology, and to aid them by recalling the significance of old myths. Now, he encouraged the awareness of these myths. In response to the interview question, how would you define mythology? Joseph Campbell answered, my favorite definition of mythology, other people's religion. My favorite definition of religion, misunderstanding mythology. So in religious views, most religions contain a body of traditional or sacred stories that are believed to express profound truth. Some religious organizations and practitioners believe that all of their traditional stories are not only sacred, but true, but also historically accurate and divinely revealed. Thus, calling such stories myths disrespects their special status. Other religious organizations and practitioners have no problems categorizing their sacred stories as myths. Modern day opposition. Some religious believers take offense when you consider historical aspects of the faith to be labeled as myths. Some believers distinguish between religious fables or myths on one hand, and on those sacred narratives which are described by their tradition as being historical and relevant, or history revelation. For instance, Catholic priest Father John A. Hardin insists that Christianity is not mythology. What we believe in is not religious fantasies. No matter how pious, evangelical Christian theologian Carl F. H. Henry insisted that Judeo-Christian revelation has nothing in common with the category myth. Especially with Christianity, the objection to the word myth rests on a historical basis. By the time of Christ, the Greco-Roman world has started to use the term myth, Greek mythos. And this meant fable, fiction, lie. And as a result, the early Christian theologians used myth in this sense. Thus, the derogatory meaning of theologians' use of myth, in the traditional Christian meaning, and expression Christian mythology is used in academic discourse, may offend Christians for this reason. In addition, the early Christian term myth passed into popular usage. Thus, when essential sacred mysteries and teachings are described as myth in modern English, the word still implies that this idle fantasy, fiction, or falsehood. This description could be taken in a direct attack on religious belief. Quite contrary, the meaning ostensibly intended to the academic use of the word, further in academic writing through myth, usually means a fundamental worldview story, and that there is occasionally ambiguous or clearly denotes falsehood, as in the Christ myths theory. In original term, mythos, which has no pejorative connotation in English, may be a better word to distinguish the positive definition from the negative. Modern day clergy and practitioners have, within some religious movements, have no problems whatsoever classifying the religious sacred stories as myths. They see the sacred stories and texts as indeed containing religious truths, divinely inspired, but delivered in the language of manhood. Here's some examples. Christianity. J.R.R. Tolkien's love of myths and devout Catholic faith came together in his assertion that mythology is a divine echo of the truth. Tolkien wrote that myths hold fundamental things. He expressed these beliefs in his poem, Mythology, circa 1931, which describes myth-making as an act of sub-creation within God as a primary creation. The poem in part is myth-woven, an elf pattern. Here's part of the poem. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tint, myth-woven, an elf pattern, whence have all birth. Myth-woven, an elf pattern, and no earth, unless the mother's womb, whence have all birth. Now, Tolkien's opinion, expressed by another Christian writer, C.S. Lewis, in their conversations, Tolkien explained to Lewis that the story of Christ was true, and it was a true myth, at the very history and at the root of reality. He goes on to call the Christ story a true myth. Again, he believed that even pagan myths expressed spiritual truths. In his opinion, the difference between Christ's story and the pagan myths is only that the Christ story is historically as well as spiritually true. Lewis writes, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, working on us the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one where the others are men's myths, the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as found there. While Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. Back and forth for a while. Another Christian writer, the Catholic priest Father Andrew Greeley, freely applies the term myth to Christianity in his book, Myths and Religion. He defends this terminology. Quote, many Christians have objected to my use of the word myth, even when I defined it specifically. They are terrified by this word and may even have a slight suggestion of fantasy. However, my usage is one that is common among historians of religion, literary critics, and social scientists. It is valuable and a helpful usage. There is no other word which conveys these scholarly traditions and what they mean when they refer to the word myth. The Christian would be well advised to get over his fear of the word and appreciate how important a tool it can be for understanding the content of his faith. At a consultation on the relationship between the Wesleyan tradition and the natural sciences in Kansas City, Missouri on October 19, 1991, Dennis Bratcher presented a discussion of the adaptation of Near Eastern mythological thought by the Israelites. Bratcher argued that the Old Testament absorbs Near Eastern pagan mythology, although he did draw a sharp distinction between the literal interpretation of the myths of the Near Eastern pagans and the mythopoetic use of imagery from pagan myth by the Hebrews, which also would be the Kabbalah. During this presentation, he gave the following disclaimer. He termed myth here used does not mean false or fiction. Webster's definition in its primary and more technical meaning, myth refers to a story or a group of stories that serve to explain how a society views their work. Judaism, some Jewish scholars, including Dov Noy, a professor of folklore at Hebrew University and founder of the Israelite Folktale Archives, and Howard Schwartz, Jewish anthologist and English professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, they have discussed the traditional Jewish stories as mythology. Schwartz authored the book, Tree of Souls, Mythology of Judaism. It consists of myths and belief statements excerpted from, and in some cases, synthesized from a number of excerpts from both biblical and non-biblical Jewish texts. According to Schwartz, Jewish people continue to elaborate on and compose in addition to their traditional mythology. In the book's introduction, Schwartz states that the word myth, as used in his book, is not offered to mean something that is not true, as in the current popular usage. Finally, Neo-Paganism. Neo-pagans frequently refer to their sacred stories as myths. Asatru, a modern-day revival of Germanic paganism, holds that Eddas, myths, and Norse sagas are the divinely inspired wisdom of its religion. Wicca and other neo-pagan movements also apply the term mythology to their stories. Thank you. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Bobby.